And now we're going to turn it over to Melissa Wing. First off, I want to say Melissa is a Canadian historian based in Victoria, British Columbia. She has a Bachelor of Arts with an honors in history from the University of the Fraser Valley and a Master of Arts in history from the University of Victoria. Her research examines war correspondence and media coverage during the First and Second World Wars. She's also working on expanding her graduate research to complete a book on the Salvation Army Doughnut Girls during the First World War. I can see Melissa presenting on that in the future. In addition to her academic work, Melissa is a contract historical researcher and the Assistant Archivist at the Sidney Museum and Archives on Vancouver Island. Outside her work, she's also an executive board member of the Friends of the British Columbia Archives. So please join me in welcoming Melissa to our live stream series.
Hello.
There you go.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Are we all set and ready to go?
It is yours. I'm going to
Oh,
mute
great.
my mic and
Great. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. I today will be talking about Dieppe, very controversial topic, I know. Dieppe, war correspondence, and war reporting. So we'll just jump right into it. In the early morning hours of August 19th, 1942, Canadian 2nd Division began their assault on the French port town of Dieppe, codenamed Operation Jubilee. The joint operation between the Canadian and British Army, Navy, and Air Force was the second attempt at an amphibious assault on Dieppe. Moreover, for Canadian soldiers and war correspondents, it was a long-awaited chance at combat. Under the command of British Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten and British Combined Operations Headquarters, the Canadians were sent into an almost impossible condition with little operational support from the air and sea. The original mission for the Canadians was not to capture the town, but to inflict as much damage as possible on German fortifications and facilities. However, this was foolish thinking. On the far northern flanks at Puy, the Royal Regiment of Canada and officers from the Royal Highland Regiment were massacred by German machine gun fire in the narrow cove between the cliffs and the sea. On the southern flank in Pourville, at the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, sorry, my mistake, of Canada were initially able to hold off German defenses, but quickly lost what little advantage they had and were pinned down while they began the retreat from the beaches. Without securing the two flanks at Pourville and Puy, the Canadians at the center at Dieppe had no chance at holding the beaches there. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and Essex Scottish Regiment, with the support of the 14th Calgary Tank Regiment, barely made it out of the landing crafts and onto the beaches. The small groups of infantry soldiers that managed to make their way into Dieppe were able to accomplish little of their mission. Plus, the majority of the tanks deployed in support of infantry units were destroyed before even making it to shore. The half-dozen tanks that managed to survive were stranded on the beaches and unable to move past concrete barriers, blocking their way into town. Poor planning and extremely hard terrain led to one of the deadliest days for the Canadian Army during the Second World War. Of the 4,963 Canadians deployed to Dieppe, 907 of them were killed in action and 586 were wounded, and 1,946 were taken prisoner of war. In the weeks following the Dieppe Raid, the Canadian public watched as two separate stories unfolded in the newspapers, magazines, and broadcast radio. One of them, the official message by the Canadian Army of success, juxtaposed by the tremendous number of Canadian losses that were being published in the papers. This led to the public questioning the truth. Was Dieppe a success or a disaster? The question continues to plague historians for almost over 80 years now. The role, legacy, and purpose of the Dieppe Raid has long been debated by military historians and within historiography of the Second World War. However, this talk does not try and reopen that discourse surrounding military strategy and underlying intentions of the battle, Rather, I will be talking about the war correspondents themselves, their experiences at Dieppe, and some of the fumbles that the Canadian Army Public Relations had while this operation unfolded, and how Dieppe followed these war correspondents throughout their lives after they left the beaches. We got the next slide. Great. So how does one become a war correspondent? To become a war correspondent, at least in the Canadian context, journalists couldn't just hop on a boat and make their way to the front, but some did try, including one of the ones that does end up at Dieppe, so we'll get to that later. There was a process that prospective war correspondents had to follow. It all starts with the Canadian Army Public Relations Unit. During the opening months of the Second World War, the Canadians did not have an official public relations establishment overseas. For a brief period, arrangements were made through Canadian Military Headquarters, London, for all prospective press activities to go through teams at Canada House and British Public Relations. However, the team at Canada House was straining to stay afloat against the onslaught of publicity and access requests from the press. As a result, gaining war correspondent accreditation was like the Wild Wild West. Some journalists and news agencies, like the Canadian Press, made arrangements directly with the Army and with MacNaughton, effectively overstepping the Canadian military headquarters and the British. However, as more and more Canadian soldiers arrived in London, there was a dire need for some kind of public relations position within the Canadian Army to bring order to this chaos. It was not until late January 1940 that a designated public relations officer was appointed to CMHQ London, Canadian Military Headquarters London, to oversee all publicity arrangements and become the foundation of the Canadian Army Public Relations Unit for the entirety of the war. Blessed to be a war correspondent with the Canadian Army, press representatives, whether in print or radio or whatever fashion, needed to submit a formal application to Canadian Army Public Relations. Requests could not be submitted by the individual, but rather the press organization in which the journalist was attached to. So a newspaper editor, magazine editor, etc. Pending the verification of their background and identity check, the application was sent to the High Commissioners Committee for Wartime Publicity at Canada House in London for final approval. The committee, in consultation with the press, decided the number of licenses that could be granted throughout the war, and thus dictated how many war correspondents were allowed to operate overseas at any given time. As a war correspondent, journalists were purposely integrated into the military structure and hierarchy. As Timothy Balzer explains, creating a journalist-friendly environment for war correspondents was a priority for Canadian Army Public Relations. If war correspondents saw themselves as an integral part of the military organization, they were, in theory, less likely to write critically of the Army's actions, blunders, or failures. War correspondents were subject to military law, given weapons training, were situated with military hierarchy structure, they were given the rank of officer, and were provided with a Canadian Army uniform with the words war correspondent inscribed on the shoulder right here. Armlets with the word press were written in red letters on the right arm and were issued to be worn at all times. Media organizations made sure their prospective war correspondents understood the risks of covering an active war zone. For example, prospective sound engineers for the CBC overseas unit, so these were the guys that recorded any broadcasts overseas and had, were in the big truck and had all the recording equipment. They were asked a series of questions similar to military enlistment papers. Individuals were asked to disclose their marital status, with single men taking priority over married men, prove that they could be physically fit, prove that they could drive a truck, and detail their experiences or skills related to operating broadcast recording equipment in the field. Although war correspondents were asked to take on many of the responsibilities of military service, press representatives could not apply for a war correspondent's license in replacement of any mandatory or promised military service. Even though the role of a war correspondent was considered vital to the war effort, it was not considered an essential service. In fact, Canadian war correspondent regulations explicitly stated that a correspondence license did not exempt a holder from any liability, military, or obligatory war service. Over the course of the war, newsrooms were already losing journalists and other media personnel to voluntary enlistment. However, any sort of mandatory service caused excess strain on personnel. As media historian Mark Burry notes, newsrooms were stripped to the bone. The kind of generous, adventurous, courageous young man who would make a good reporter was also the type and the most likely to enlist. End quote. Although newsrooms across the country were facing the same personnel shortages and problems, the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and CP, the Canadian Press, were hit the hardest. A significant portion of their personnel left their newsrooms to enlist in service. Like all organizations, the CBC and CP tried their best to find solutions to personnel shortages. This included applying for deferments for military service and also hiring women to fill gaps in the newsroom. On the slide, you'll see sorry, I've got the side profile here, a war correspondent license for Gregory Clark. He was actually a soldier during the First World War and fought at Vimy as well, and then became a war correspondent during the Second World War. And that's his press and war license there. So once the plans for Operation Jubilee were finalized, 13 war correspondents from various newspapers, magazines, and radio broadcasters were permitted to join the invasion. Of the 13, there were 6 American war correspondents, 4 Canadian war correspondents, and 3 British war correspondents. Originally, the Canadians held 8 positions for war correspondents. However, the Army decided to give 3 of their positions to American journalists in hopes that witnessing Canadian action would increase Canadian publicity within the American media landscape. As a result, the Canadian contingent of war correspondents consisted of Robert Bowman of the CBC, Ross Monroe of the Canadian Press, Fred Griffin of the Toronto Daily Star, and Wallace Rayburn of the Montreal Standard. Overseeing the team of Canadian war correspondents for Dieppe was Public Relations Officer Major Clifford Wallace. On the screen, you'll see other war correspondents and other public relations officers, or PROs. Unfortunately, I cannot find a single photo of Clifford Wallace. So these were PROs we'll have to do as a visual today. No stranger to the media business, Clifford Wallace came from a well-known newspaper family in Western Canada. In 1920, Wallace began his career as a reporter with the Toronto Daily Star and quickly climbed the ranks to assistant city editor. Established in his career, Wallace went on to hold positions of managing editor for both the Edmonton Journal and the Globe and Mail. With the outbreak of war, Wallace enlisted with the Toronto Scottish Regiment and was sent overseas in December 1939. In 1942, Wallace was drawn back to his roots and became a public relations officer with 1st Canadian Army. As the public relations officer in the field, Wallace was in charge of escorting Canadian war correspondents to and from the front from London, ensuring war correspondents had all pertinent information for military operations at hand and had access to all necessary resources and equipment before they joined their assigned regiments. It was common for public relations officers to actually be taken from enlisted ranks, and the Canadian military headquarters and the public relations officer, the main public relations officer, Mr. Abel, would look through the enlisted men and try and handpick some of the ones that had journalistic backgrounds and recruit them to become a public relations officer. And so that's how most of the public relations officers come to be, including Wallace. Due to the secrecy of Operation Jubilee, Wallace informed the 4 Canadian war correspondents of their assignment in stages. The war correspondents were moved from London to Bath, a small city in southern England, with vague information that they would be joining one of the biggest Canadian Army operations to date. To conceal their identity and not to raise suspicion, Wallace ordered the correspondents to remove their press badges and change their ranks on their uniforms from captain to lieutenant while they waited for the raid in Bath. They were also told not to buy anything in certain areas of town where there would be any Canadians walking around, especially not any supplies for the raid, such as water bottles or compasses, etc. It was not until the day before the raid that Wallace gathered the group of Canadian war correspondents one final time to brief them on their true location and operation. In a letter written to fellow war correspondent after the war, Robert Bowman described the moment that he found out where they were going. He says, "We were briefed for the raid by Cliff Wallace, who gathered the correspondents in a latticed summer house in the middle of the park, which nobody could approach without being seen. And he kept me on sentry duty outside while he put the others into the picture. I didn't know until they came out where we were going, and Cliff told me, it's Dieppe." Now I'm going to go through our 4 war correspondents and how they experienced Dieppe and to what various stages, and we'll go through the 4 one by one. So the first is Robert Bowman. Robert Bowman, or Bob Bowman, was one of the first members of the CBC Overseas Unit and the first official war correspondent for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. A.E. Powley, a fellow war correspondent for the CBC, described Bowman as a large, curly-headed, and cheerful young man. Bowman is the one in the slide holding the microphone. Prior to his career as a war correspondent, Bowman established himself as a prominent radio personality for the CBC through his reporting. Also, in June 1939, Bowman garnered national recognition for his CBC Live broadcast coverage of the royal tour of King George and Queen Elizabeth. And the CBC chose Bowman as their first war correspondent, not only because of his established career, but more importantly, for his belief that the CBC held a patriotic duty to cover the war and keep Canadians informed. For example, at the start of the war, Bowman was secretly flown to Halifax to cover the departure of the first Canadian soldiers to Europe. However, Bowman didn't know the reason for the assignment until he arrived. After learning the Army was to transport these men from Halifax and taking the 1st Canadian Division to England, Bowman jumped on the chance to possibly go with him. Bowman explains, quote, "What they wanted me to do was to make recordings along the waterfront while our troops went aboard ships. They'd be singing and joking, and I would make recordings. And then when they arrived at their destination, whenever that would be, I would be back in Canada with these recordings, and I'd be able to broadcast how our troops had left. You see, it had to be kept all a secret. Well, I said, nuts to that. If our troops are going overseas, the CBC is going with them." Once Bowman was in Britain, like other war correspondents and Canadians, he grew restless at Aldershot. Bowman also was one of the ones who, since he kind of sneakily got to Britain, didn't have a war correspondent's license, tried to finagle his way into becoming a war correspondent while he was there, but he had to sail back to Canada, reapply for the license, and then managed to get back out there and get it all settled. So once he was back there, waiting, 1941-42, he was getting pretty restless and was itching to get into the fight, like many of the Canadian soldiers that were posted in England. Furthermore, Bowman was faced with challenges unique to his role as a broadcaster. Throughout his first years in England, Bowman and the CBC and other CBC radio broadcasters continually fought with Canadian military headquarters on the validity and the need for broadcast reporting. In a letter sent to the CBC's programming director, E.L. Bushnell, Bowman wrote, "I'm really tired of sitting here doing 8 minutes of broadcasting a week when I should be working to help the war effort, and I want to do something about it, and I want something done about it," end quote. Bowman got his wish as he was called to Dieppe. So for Operation Jubilee, Bowman was assigned to the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment, also known as the Calgary Tank Regiment. During the raid, he was on board a landing craft in hopes of reaching the main beaches at Dieppe, codename Red Beach and White Beach. However, the landing craft Bowman was in never reached the shore. From the landing craft, Bowman frantically scribbled notes on what he witnessed around him as they floated in the Dieppe harbor for just over 8 hours, dodging bombings and shell fire. At this point in the war, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation did not have any portable recording equipment that was suitable for an amphibious assault. As such, Bowman's report was recorded upon his return to London after the raid. At the top of his broadcast, Bowman tells Canadians, "And now I'm just going to quote from the notes I took as we went along, written in darkness, some written under heavy gunfire, and they are now smeared and dirty from the cordite." Throughout the 14-minute broadcast, Bowman describes the battle in detail from his vantage point in the landing craft and doesn't shy away from admitting that he witnessed heavy Canadian casualties. The Dieppe Raid would be Bowman's first and last battle as a war correspondent. After the raid, Bowman was called back to Canada on assignment to possibly do a tour about his reporting at Dieppe. But then that assignment changed to touring Australia and New Zealand for another purpose. Also, Bowman's time in the CBC was quickly coming to an end as the CBC took on new leadership and the direction of the CBC overseas unit took on a new face. Bowman clashed with the executive team and decided to leave. Nonetheless, Bowman is still credited as one of the pioneering members of the CBC overseas unit, and his broadcast on Dieppe remains a key part of his legacy. Frederick Griffin is next. I don't have too much on Frederick Griffin, mostly because my ability to access the Toronto Star has been cut off. So this is a shorter section, but nonetheless, it's still very important. So Frederick Griffin, otherwise known as Griff by his colleagues, was a war correspondent for the Toronto Star newspaper. Griffin was also assigned to the Calgary Tank Regiment during Dieppe Raid. However, he was in a different landing craft than Bowman. Griffin was the oldest of the Canadian war correspondents assembled for Dieppe. At 55 years of age, the Irish Canadian entered the war as a veteran parliamentary and foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star. Griffin began his career at the Toronto Star as a library clerk and climbed his way to become a world-renowned journalist. Prior to 1939, Griffin was a war correspondent during the Spanish Civil War, but was called to New York to cover the American presidential election before that conflict came to an end. Excuse me. During the opening years of the Second World War, Griffin covered war news across the globe, including England, France, Bermuda, United States, and of course the Canadian home front. However, accompanying troops from the Canadian 2nd Division at Dieppe was Griffin's first battlefield experience as a war correspondent. Like Bowman, Griffin was stranded in the harbor and never reached the beachhead. Nevertheless, Griffin produced a series of human interest pieces for the Toronto Daily Star, with each of them centered on a different member of the Calgary Tank Regiment and their stand at Dieppe. By the end of the war, Griffin was a battle-hardened war correspondent and approaching his 60s. In an article about Griffin's life as a journalist, Griffin's daughter, Mary Ferns, revealed that her father had suffered a heart attack during the Dieppe Raid, but didn't tell any public relations officers, such as Clifford Wallace or the Toronto Star and his editors, for fear that he would be pulled from the front. Fern explains, quote, "When you're terrified, it contributes to exhaustion, especially when you're over 50 years old. He was thin and drawn and just exhausted when he came back." Griffin's body and mind had suffered too much damage during the war as he overworked himself to cover the ins and outs of the Canadians moving through Europe. And unfortunately, he did pass away on January 15th, 1946, as a result of his war service. Our next war correspondent is probably the most famous war correspondent to ever lived in Canada, especially most famous war correspondent during the Second World War, Ross Munro. So in 1940, Ross Munro was moved from the Canadian Press in Ottawa to their offices in London and became the agency's sole war correspondent. Munro is arguably the most famous war correspondent, and his success is outstanding and should be attributed to his work ethic, clever thinking, and engaging writing. However, working for the Canadian Press as a war correspondent had its advantages, and as a result, set the foundations for Munro's national and international recognition. Munro began his journalism career with the news agency, the Canadian Press, only a few years before the outbreak of the war, and actually fresh out of university. So he was only 26 years old when he landed on the Dieppe beaches. Unlike other media organizations, and this is crucial to understand why Munro was able to do what he did. So unlike other media organizations, the Canadian Press was and still is a news agency. So under their mandate, they have the ability to distribute their content nationwide through a membership of newspapers. So they're not a single publication, but rather they'll write different dispatches and send them across the country, which meant that Munro's reach and his voice was in every single household in Canada during the war and became a recognizable name through that process. During the interwar years, the Canadian Press established itself as a valuable news agency within the Canadian media landscape. And as media historian Jean Allen notes, before the war, the Canadian Press made a concentrated effort to cement their position as the leading news provider in Canada and succeeded. Their established reputation helped them cultivate a crucial relationship with top Canadian military officials once the war broke out, and they were able to push for exclusive coverage of the Canadian war effort overseas and at home. During the opening months of the war, interest of the Canadian Press and those of the 1st Canadian Division, Lieutenant General Andrew G.L. McNaughton, I'm sure a familiar face or name to all of us here. The two of them had aligned interests. A career man, McNaughton believed in the power of the press and public opinion, if harnessed correctly. McNaughton granted the Canadian Press exclusive access to Canadian soldiers as long as 1st Canadian Division gained press recognition he believed it deserved. Thus, due to the Canadian Press's preferential treatment, the Canadian Army and Munro were able to have access to the Canadians at base in Aldershot, unlike any of the other war correspondents that were there during that time. They're also guaranteed access to all Canadian battle engagements, and you can't argue, but Ross Munro had the best access of any war correspondent that was attached to the Canadians, and because of that, he succeeded greatly. As I mentioned previously, Ross Munro was the youngest journalist among the Dieppe war correspondents, and he was also the only one amongst the 4 of them that had previous battle experience. For Operation Jubilee, Munro was assigned to the Royal Regiment of Canada, who were set to land at Puy, otherwise known as Blue Beach. Munro accompanied the first wave of the landing craft as they approached the beaches at dawn and reached the rocky beach at Puy just shortly after. Munro described his time on the landing craft as, quote, the grimmest 20 minutes of his life. As many of you know, the Canadians faced extraordinary resistance by the Germans at Blue Beach. And Munro's published account of the Dieppe Raid does not shy away from the brutality of the onslaught that they faced. He writes, by the time our boat touched the beach, the din was in crescendo. I peered out the slope lying just in front of us, and it was startling to discover it was dotted with the fallen forms of men in battle dress. The royals ahead of us had been cut down as they stormed the slope. It had come home to me only then that every one of those men had gone down under the bullets of the enemy at the top of the incline. During the raid, Monroe hid behind, in his words, a flimsy piece of metal by the stern on the long side of the landing craft and witnessed the carnage unfold. Monroe recalls in his memoirs that from his vantage point on the landing craft, he witnessed more than a dozen of men shot within minutes as the off-ramp was unfurling into the water. Monroe outlines the carnage in great detail, and he writes out how one soldier was shot in the head and ended up sprawled across his legs for the majority of the raid. He writes as well the heartbreaking story where a young soldier lay dying next to Monroe, screaming, "Christ, we got to beat them, we got to beat them." And the man died within minutes, screaming defiantly as he passed. Also in Monroe's memoirs, he writes, "In no other front have I seen such carnage. It was brutal and terrible and shocked you almost to incessantly see the piles of dead and feel the hopelessness of the attack at this point." Eventually, Monroe's landing craft was pulled off the beach after too many casualties. They left for the raid with 80 men and were returning with 20. Among them, more than half were wounded in some way or another. To find out more information on the battle, Monroe managed to finagle his way out of that landing craft and get onto another landing craft that was attempting to get onto the main beaches at Dieppe. On this new landing craft, Monroe finally was able to set foot on the pebble beaches of Pourville. Monroe was finally able to set foot at Dieppe, but only for a couple of seconds. As he tried to scramble his way to the beach, he was immediately hit with too much fire and had to turn back. He made his way back to the landing craft and watched as the Canadians tried to retreat from the beaches. In all his dispatches of Dieppe, Monroe described the raid as a bloody and heroic triumph. However, British censors heavily redacted his original coverage on the operation. Jean Allen, media historian, explains, quote, "For the Canadian press, Dieppe left a complicated legacy. On one hand, Monroe's first person coverage of the raid was compelling and demonstrated his personal courage and resourcefulness. It was reprinted in many US newspapers via the Associated Press and broadcasted worldwide by the British Broadcasting Corporation. On the other hand, as Monroe and others eventually realized, the initial censored coverage had been radically incomplete and at best deceptive at worst." To produce his firsthand account of the raid, Monroe stayed awake for 3 days straight writing at his typewriter. Fellow war correspondent D.E. Burritt described Monroe flying into the Canadian press offices after Dieppe in London as a, quote, "tall, unshaven young man who wore, quote, his torn, blood-stained battle dress and sat at his desk frantically typing away." Burritt also writes, quote, "For 3 days and as many nights, he had not been to bed, and now he sat typing from scribbled sheafs of paper. He smoked endlessly and nibbled on Benzedrine tablets given to him by the Canadian medical officer to keep his eyelids open," unquote. Monroe spent hours trying to write the most encompassing account that would also pass the double censors, and spent much of those 3 days writing, rewriting, editing, and writing again. After Dieppe, Monroe went on to report from North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the campaign through Northwest Europe. In fact, he was the correspondent to scoop Normandy, and learned how to do it based on what he did at Dieppe. Looking back on his career as a war correspondent during the Second World War, Monroe stated that Dieppe was the only time he felt the public had been cheated by the censors. However, Monroe could never go on to actually say that Dieppe was a failure, but rather he always talked about the battle as a triumph of human resilience. That's him there in Italy. It's a very famous photo of him. It's actually on the front of Burry's book. And then this is a photo of men training before Dieppe, and he is somewhere in that photo merging around. Our last correspondent, and our correspondent who made it up the beach, is Wallace Rayburn. So of all the Canadian War correspondents who joined Operation Jubilee, Wallace Rayburn of the Montreal Standard was the only war correspondent to reach the shores of Dieppe and stay there throughout the battle. Rayburn was assigned to the South Saskatchewan Regiment and landed at Green Beach just south of Pourville. Rayburn's landing craft made its way onto the beaches, dodging shell fire, and they reached the beach just as the first streaks of daylight were breaking through the sky. The landing craft hit the pebble beachhead, and the men dashed 50 yards to the seawall without any incident. After the battle, Rayburn described that from where they were situated on the beach, originally at that point during the day, the German gunfire couldn't reach them. He writes, "The Pourville beach is long and straight, and the machine gunners couldn't get the angle necessary to get us from where they were," end quote. The wire cutters failed to make a path of the beach for Rayburn and the men, so the group adjusted position to an abandoned blockhouse. Later on in his memoirs, he notes that he thought it was really weird that there was just a blockhouse there and there's over 40 men sitting in it, and how it was a prime opportunity for the Germans to booby trap it. Turns out they did booby trap it. They just didn't set it off or cause an explosion until after Rayburn and his group of men left. No reason why they know, but that's what he recalls in his memoirs. So there's about 40 of them. They use this as a small respite from enemy fire. And then from the blockhouse, they made their way to an abandoned house and set up battalion headquarters. From the house in Pourville, Rayburn observed the battle and watched the Canadians attempt to clear house after house around them and take German prisoners. However, their position soon became bogged down, and they left the house to push further into Dieppe and Pourville. The group of men didn't get farther than a few dozen feet before they were hit by mortar fire, and the explosion sent Rayburn flying and left him with shrapnel wound in his back. This is also only about an hour into the day, and Rayburn is there for about 8 hours, so he's wounded pretty early on. Nonetheless, they kept advancing towards Dieppe. Snipers peppered the roofs of the popular vacation town, and Rayburn writes, "The roadway and pavements were being peppered with sniper bullets, and I could hear them pinging on the concrete and clattering against the fences as I joined in the crouching jog trot of troops," end quote. As the Canadians tried to take the bridge, Rayburn watched and took notes. When the soldiers fell, Rayburn took up a stretcher and assisted with the wounded. The street fighting continued throughout the day as various battalions tried to make their way farther into town, and Rayburn followed them, dodging the Canadian onslaught of bullets, mortar fire, and artillery. Rayburn and members of the South Saskatchewan Regiment were on land and in Dieppe for just over 6 hours by the time the decision was made to retreat. Rayburn outlines his experiences at Dieppe in his book, The Glorious Chapter and Rehearsal for Invasion, both of which were published during the war years. Throughout his writings, Rayburn is extremely patriotic, and this is also an extension of his coverage of the battle. For the rest of his life, Rayburn maintained that what he witnessed and what he wrote was true, even if the justification for Dieppe was no longer legitimate. There's actually a new book as well. Rayburn's son, Ross Rayburn, re-released these two books with a couple of extra sources and annotations from Wallace Rayburn. And you might think to yourself, Ross Rayburn, that's an interesting coincidence. It's not. Ross Rayburn is actually named after Ross Monroe. The two of them were very close friends. So that's another interesting tidbit. So noticeably absent from the list of Canadian war correspondents assigned to cover Dieppe were any members of the Canadian Film and Photo Unit. Interestingly enough, Canadian war correspondent accreditation did not extend to media organizations seeking war correspondent license for photographers. Newspaper photographs in the field went against British Army policy, and thus Canadian military headquarters and combined operations headquarters would not allow photographs or photographers to become war correspondents for independent newspapers. However, this didn't stop Canadian media organizations from trying. Over the duration of the war, editors at the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail had their multiple requests for photographers denied. Unlike the written or spoken word, visuals of war hold a particularly visceral power over audiences. As a result, it should not come as a surprise that the Canadian Army wanted to ensure that all photos and film were collected in-house through the Canadian Army Film and Photo Units. Although the Canadian Army Film and Photo Unit was a crucial tool for Canadian propaganda effort, like the Canadian Public Relations Office, the Film and Photo Unit began the war with little institutional structure. The foundations for the unit was established in January 1941, and the talks of a designated film unit began to arise in London, but it wasn't actually set up until later that year. And then we have this unit in October 1941. I'm just looking at the time, so I'm trying to wrap it up a little quicker. Led by former commercial cameraman and director of the Associated Screen News, Lieutenant Jack McDougall, ended up leading the Canadian Army Film Unit during the time of the Dieppe Raid. As the Dieppe Raid approached, Canadian Public Relations Officer Major Wallace requested that members of the Canadian Army and Film Unit join the raid to film the Canadians during the assault for the Public Relations Office. The Dieppe Raid would be the film unit's first taste of combat, and the team was anxious for the opportunity to capture the impending battle. Assigned to cover the raid was cameraman Sergeant Alan Grayston and still photographer Lieutenant Frank Royal, and these are his photos here. However, when the raid was rescheduled to August, Sergeant George Cooper was assigned. However, when the raid was rescheduled to August, there we go. Sergeant George Cooper was assigned to replace Grayston, who was otherwise on assignment. Days before the attack, the two men arrived at Army HQ to receive their assignment. But Royal and Cooper were told, quote, the job was not important enough to warrant sending two men, and sent Cooper, the only Canadian cameraman, back to London. However, neither Royal nor the three British cameramen got ashore. One British still photographer, Sergeant Holloway, did land on Green Beach with Wallace Rayburn in Pourville, but he was unfortunately shot in the eye and presumed missing by the end of the day, and his photos were never recovered. It is absolutely astonishing, but between both Allied nations, zero media was captured or recorded of the Canadians hitting the beaches. Thus, when the Canadian National Film Board asked the film unit for footage for such a pivotal moment in Canadian history, McDougall had the humiliating task of telling the film board that there was no Canadian footage. The only images or film of the Dieppe Raid were taken by the Germans, and to this day, the images we see of the Dieppe beaches after the raid were ones taken by German propaganda photographers, including the one actually in the promo for this talk. When Grayston learned that Canada's only cameraman on assignment was not sent with the Canadian troops to Dieppe, he was furious. According to Cooper and fellow Canadian Army Film Unit cameraman Al Fraser, Grayston let out his frustrations with a couple of drinks before returning to film headquarters and yelling at McDougall, and fired his revolver in the air and through a glass door. He let off 5 shots, apparently. Amazingly, Grayston didn't actually shoot anyone. However, he was demoted to private for 30 days and spent a couple of hours with military police. Lieutenant McDougall was also frustrated, but contrary to Grayston's outburst, he put his concerns to paper in a memorandum addressed to Canadian Army Public Relations and Canadian Military Headquarters, London. In the memo, McDougall writes, quote, In views of these facts, it is rather surprising that 3 British Army Film Unit cameramen and 2 of their still photographers and 1 civilian newsreel cameraman accompanied Dieppe expedition. It becomes more that surprising when you consider that that this was in effect a Canadian show. The importance of propaganda purposes of adequate film coverage is obvious, as is the desirability of using Canadian Army Film Unit to obtain it. The film unit was created for this very purpose. I have no explanation from Public Relations Office Army and can conceive of none why our cameraman, Private Cooper, was returned to Canadian military headquarters after having been requested and when an operation was impending. In any event, we should have been asked to supply 3 cameramen instead of 1. Where the fault lies, I have no way of knowing, but the fact remains that we had a definite job to do. We were trained, prepared, and equipped to do it, and when the time came to do it, we were deliberately ignored." End quote. This embarrassing incident led McDougall to demand Canadian Military Headquarters London to develop a policy for producing operational film coverage. Furthermore, McDougall threatened that if the matter was not resolved within a matter of weeks, he would resign from his position. The combination of the debacle with the National Film Board and McDougall's possible pending resignation forced the Canadian Military Headquarters to establish a policy of operational film coverage by the end of September. After the war, Operation Jubilee and the correspondents' role in the Dieppe Raid followed Canadian correspondents through their lives and their careers. When the reality of the horrors of Dieppe began to reach the public, war correspondents were accused of purposely deceiving the Canadian public. However, as historian Timothy Balzer explains, quote, "Lack of detail in the official account led to speculation, mainly about the composition of the raiding force and the number of casualties, thus causing inaccurate reporting. Observing the battle from the eye of the storm definitely has its drawbacks. Although the 4 Canadian correspondents we talked about today were at Dieppe to witness the battle, the fog of war settled over their line of sight and their memories. Without enough information to form a complete picture, Bowman, Monroe, Griffin, and Wallace depended on what they witnessed, supplemented by what the Army told them. Furthermore, the correspondents were operating under not only their ordinary sensors, but also the combined operation sensors, which were very, very hard to get through for this raid. No copy was cleared to be published until after a full debrief was held between the war correspondents and British High Command. Dieppe is still a point of contention, and the words of war correspondents will always be at the heart of that dispute. However, I think, especially, I hope what I've showed today is that it's important to take a step back and just see what they witnessed and how they wrote about the battle and see what the barriers they faced. And that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Can I ask, while we turn to questions, can you stop sharing your slides so that we can
Yes.
see you?
See more.
And then normally we have we ask for questions from YouTube
Great.
in the chat. We don't actually have any questions there yet. There's a little bit of a delay, as we said. I'm going to start with a couple questions, if that's all right, and hopefully some others will jump in here. I'm wondering if you can, this is a little bit outside your scope, but I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of war correspondence in other countries. Did Canada follow a very similar model? Was it just based on a British model and Americans were different, or was it almost universal?
Yeah, each country had their own setup. The Canadians definitely fell under the British scope because technically Canada was working closely with the British, and their press operations for at least Dieppe and the early part of the war was driven by the British. They followed their line of thinking and their line of operations. The Americans, their big difference is that they allowed women correspondents, whereas the Canadians were firm that they would not allow women on the front or anywhere near the front. There were a couple of women that tried. There was one very wonderful Spitfire of a Canadian war correspondent. She kept sneaking her way as close to the front as possible and then being disciplined. And then she had to eventually end up with a American newspaper because no Canadian newspaper wanted to deal with her anymore. So that's the thing. If you wanted a Canadian war correspondent license, you couldn't get it as a woman. But if you wanted an American war correspondent license, you could get it as a woman. And same for photographers and cameramen. The Americans did allow private photographers and private cameramen to go to the front. Thus, we have like people like Lee Miller, and there's a really fantastic documentary on Netflix, if anyone still has Netflix, called The Five That Came Back, or The Six That Came Back, and it's about the cameramen for the Americans during in Europe and in the Pacific. But that's off the top what I got.
Thank you. So that actually segues into another sort of smaller question I had, asking about sort of the restrictions on the correspondence, and if, I mean, I'm sort of thinking about a correspondence in their 50s. So obviously, as you mentioned, there are restrictions on gender, but was there anything else? Like, was there a maximum age? Was anybody turned away going, you're too old for this?
Yeah, not from what I could find. It was really expensive for newspapers to send their correspondence. They weren't getting any sort of money back from the army in any way. So the newspapers really wanted to send their best overseas. And like in the case of Griffin, who's 55, when he goes over, he had a well-established career and was one of the Toronto Star's best reporters at the time. And so he was sent. I don't think at that point in the war, there was a thought, at least on behalf of the army, that war correspondents would really be getting into the thick of it. There's really a lot of nonchalant about correspondents and journalists. Some people were like, they're just here, they're annoying, they're a nuisance. And others, like McNaughton, was like, no, these guys are important, they're going to tell our story, and that's how we're going to get support at home. So after Dieppe, I mean, Griffin is still the oldest war correspondent among the Canadian contingent. The other newspapers do not send older guys. But it was not a forceful limitation on behalf of the Army or combined operations.
Interesting. So a question from our audience, asking about sort of that original correspondence. So you're mentioning sort of taking notes and that sort of thing. Was any of that survive in the archives, sort of the original notes?
Oh yeah. Clark, so the first guy I showed you, his war correspondent license, his notebooks for the entirety of the war are at Library Archives Canada. Bowman's original typewriter notes for all of his correspondence and most of the CBC guys, so that's Matthew Halton as well, Ouimet, Desjardins, all of their original typed up scripts are in the archives, and some of them are really cool because you can see where the edits are and what things got cut and what things got changed. For the most part, they're all there, which is really cool. The like in battle scribbled notes, I haven't been able to find any of those, sadly. Those would be really cool to have. But they might be somewhere. The Canadian press has their own archives that I've never been able to get into. But Jean Allen, this book, Making the National News, has a lot of that like really nitty-gritty tidbits from Ross Monroe's career. It's in here. And same with, of course, the Bible on the subject, the information found by Timothy Balzer. He also has a lot of those original scripts in here.
Fascinating. Thank you. I'm reading a message in the chat that says, what is the name of the book you referred to? So I think Tom can add those to the descriptions later so people can find them a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering about after the war. Now, you mentioned a little bit of pushback for these correspondents on, we're not being given the full story. But what was generally their treatment from the military after the war? Were they treated as veterans? Were they, was it just kind of cut loose a little bit?
Amongst the soldiers themselves, there was a feeling of camaraderie there. I mean, especially in the sense of we're talking Dieppe. Wallace Rayburn was there in the thick of it, taking injured off the front and assisting with the battle plans and talking to battle HQ, and like he was in it, even though he was a reporter and was supposed to be objective. The thing about being a war correspondent, I'm sure everybody can assume or understand, is that there's times where you just have to get in the thick of it, otherwise you're not going to make it. So amongst the soldiers themselves, there's a sense of camaraderie with them. However, there was also a sense of annoyance because war correspondents got pretty cushy treatment. Ross Monroe, when he was at Aldershot or at any of the Canadian bases, had his own like golf cart, which was crazy. And he got like ferried around everywhere. They also were able to stay in hotels. They often had swanky dinners with military brass. So there is a contrast where they're slumming it during the battle, but they get brought off the front quite frequently because they have to somehow wire service what they've been writing, especially in the sense of Normandy and Sicily and Italy, where there still isn't that a system where you can really broadcast or publish from the front. Like Monroe is sent in and out of Italy and Sicily throughout the time there. Same with Matthew Halton. And when they're not at the front, they get to stay in hotels. So that's always an interesting contrast.
Interesting. And so were they eligible for like veterans benefits and that sort of thing, or were there nothing like that?
Yeah, not from my understanding, at least for this war. It's not something I know too much about, but I'd have to look into that more.
Yeah, interesting. Another one from the chat, if that's okay, I'm just going to read this one out loud. So you mentioned Bowman being reassigned to other countries after his unblemished Dieppe report. I think you said Australia. Any chance this was a form of discipline, or was this just a normal reassignment?
Yeah. I think it was a form of, I don't get along with you and I don't want to talk to you very much. Bowman's best friend at CBC was Bushnell, who was the programming director, but they were really starting to butt heads, and Bowman would send some pretty flamboyant or colorful letters to Bushnell, complaining his discontent for the fact that they're just sitting in England doing nothing. And Bushnell was like, I can't do anything about this. So when he was brought back to Canada to do a tour of talking about Dieppe in the towns of some of these regiments, the CBC also said they needed to do a tour in New Zealand and Australia of Canadian war news and talk about that there. And so Bushnell and Bowman agreed that that would be a better assignment. And then when Bowman was in Australia, I believe, Bushnell left the CBC. And then when Bowman returned to the CBC, it was not good. Like nobody got along. In my archive findings, it was like letter after letter of him sending, complaints and them fighting. And and eventually he was like, I'm done with this. And he left. That's a very brief, it's a very detailed kerfuffle. And you can get into the thick of it actually in the information front, but also in A.E. Powley's book, his memoirs, Broadcasts from the Front. He details it as well. I have all my books here so I can cite in real time for you guys.
Well, as we say, we've got a couple more questions about books, including the one by Rayburn's son. So
Yes.
if you don't mind sending those notes to Tom or myself by email afterwards, we'll make sure they go in the description so people can follow, look for more later. One more question from online, and then I'll turn it back over to Tom, if that's all right. Asking about war correspondents as civilians and saying, I think later they would have to travel with an army conducting officer. Was that true of the 4 correspondents at Dieppe?
They were always with an intelligence officer, or because Wallace Rayburn couldn't be everywhere at once. So they were always attached to some sort of personnel. They couldn't really run amok. But for the purposes of this presentation, I just focused on what they experienced and where they were instead of the policy side of the public relations part. But you are correct. They needed to have an escort.
Fantastic. That I'm sure that could be a whole other topic of discussion, but
that is
that's that's fascinating. Thank you so much. And just before, as I say, I turn it back to Tom, I'll just say, really appreciate you bringing this forward. I mean, most of us have, I would say most even amateur historians in Canada have a baseline knowledge of Dieppe, but this is definitely a side that we've never considered, most of us. So really appreciate you bringing that forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun, and it's always exciting to share more things about war reporting.
I'm going to squeeze one question of mine in before we close this out. You talked about, I think it was McDougall and his frustration over the lack of, I guess, film operators or cameramen at Dieppe.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder, I think of the D-Day footage. I think it's the North Shore Regiment landing, it's gripping footage from inside the landing craft right down to the hand pat on the one guy's back. Like, do you think that was an outcome of his advocating for cameramen being with the forces?
Oh, big time. Yeah. It was a huge thing. That portion of the letter I read you guys is only a paragraph of a 2-page, like point by point, why this is a huge problem and how this was not only embarrassing, but also inept. Like, this is so incompetent. And it shows, again, I wanted to highlight it just because it shows that weird transition bit where the Army's still not thinking that correspondents are important, or that they're needed, because they're like, this is going to be just a nuisance in the field. I don't want to have to babysit this guy while he's taking his pictures. What does it have to do with winning the war? So there's these two fighting points of view of what's important in terms of winning a battle. And as we see at the end of Dieppe, it truly is important that we have Allied footage. I mean, the German photography and German film of Dieppe was shaped and shot for German propaganda. So still to this day, the images that we're seeing are to bring forward a point of view of German success and German destruction of Canadians. I mean, we have the famous photos of the Calgary tanks drawn across the beach and all these Canadians dead on the beach, and you would never see that kind of angle of photography or that framing from a Canadian or an Allied photographer. And that sort of shaped how we see Dieppe as well, because we see those images and we go, wow, well, no wonder people think it was a failure or feel like it was a disaster, a blunder. Like, this looks horrific. And that's because they're shot to look even more horrific as humanly possible. So going into Sicily before Normandy, there was a huge push to make sure that there was more cameramen, more photographers, that they had better equipment that could last them, and that they were able to shoot film and photos in real time and be able to publish them with the correspondent dispatches and the official communiques and get on top of that quickly. And that's all from the issues at Dieppe.
Well, maybe it might be a topic for another day. How did they manage the technology and in the time gaps? Like that's you know.
Yeah, that's actually what my original, for those of you who are watching who don't know, my original thesis was on Italy and Sicily war correspondence and the film and photo unit. Then I had to switch gears and ended up writing about Doughnut Girls, and that was fun. But on another day, I could definitely talk about the ins and outs of the technology in Sicily and Italy. It's a good time.
Well, awesome. Really appreciate you sharing some of your Saturday with us, Melissa. You've been so kind with your time with us in a variety of aspects. So yeah, I think you're a good friend of ours, and we really appreciate having you back and being able to explore a full topic with you. So this has been great. So
Thanks for having me. I always love coming back and hanging out with you guys and hanging out with your audience and talking about my research. And it's always nice to know there's other nerds out there that like this stuff.
all right, well, we'll figure out how to get the Donut Girls once you develop that more fully. So.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Thanks, everyone. This will be our last live stream until September, but I'm sure we will be posting lots of uploads and content between now and then. Appreciate you joining us today and all the times that you're with us. Remember to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and we'll see you again real soon. Take care.